we invite Dr. Bayo Akomolafe to join us today. And we were really delighted when he very quickly agreed to come. Dr. Bayo is rooted with the Yoruba people. He's a widely celebrated international speaker, a post-humanistic thinker. He is certainly a poet and a teacher and a public intellectual and essayist. He's author of 2 books, These Wilds Beyond Our Fences, and We Will Tell Our Own Story. He is chief curator of the Emergence Network and hosts an online pro-activist course, which is called We Will Dance with Mountains. He's father of Alethea and Kaya and grateful life partner of EJ. He is, as Chris Robertson recently said, a prophet of the moment. The short email exchange that I had with you, Bayo, confirmed all these things to be true. But I also found our exchange to be full of fun and life, and even in the logistics of setting up a conference agreement, there was a singing depth of poetry and a soul vitality, which was so touching and moving and encouraging to find. So question 4, the spirituality of cracks and the gift of failure at world endings. Dr. Bayo Akomolafe, the warmest welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Mary, and I greet you all. I greet this beautiful gathering here from India. There's something just flat about Zoom encounters, and I just want to wave my hands at this moment and hope you wave back wherever you are. These are very interesting times, and the joy of gathering is always a privilege. And so I want to acknowledge the ancestors, the liminal flows and forces and archetypes and movements and topographical shifts that have brought us here together, without which we could not gather. I acknowledge my wife and family and my sulking daughter who is angry that Dada is doing another talk again, but who has graciously permitted me to speak. I'm grateful to be here. Just before we dive in together, I would like to say a few things about the way that I want to show up here today. I usually don't use slides. It's not a critique against Microsoft or anything. It's just, I don't know, I like to speak in a moment and flow from there. But there's something performative about slide usage that appeals to me. So I'm not just going to be presenting information with the slides I'm giving today, but to perform and to materialize the edges, the issues that I'm hoping to contend with or wrestle with, and then I'm inviting you to contend with as well. So I think, Mary, I have the co-host powers, right? I have the power. I will jump in immediately. But just before I do, I just want to thank Mary again for inviting me. She said so many kind things about me, but I am actually here because I was mortally wounded by Mary. And I would tell you about that. Let me take you back to the scene of the crime. It was July 2021. Mary, you remember? Mary wrote this email, and basically she had questions for me. I can't remember all the questions. I think I wrote them down somewhere. Okay, I have some of them here. Yes. Okay, so the first question, she had 4 questions, and she promised me she had 4 questions. I just want you guys to feel the rudeness of what happened, how this was really impolite. She said, would you be willing to offer, she said, I have 4 questions. Would you be willing to offer so-and-so a talk, a keynote, to which I answered, yes. And the second one was, what time of the day works for you? Apparently, this time works. And so I answered, this time. The third one was, what would be fair compensation? And we talked about that. And then the final question was missing. It was just the number 4 and a dot. And Mary proceeded in her email as if nothing happened. To someone as OCD as I am, that was criminal. How dare you do that? Why would you do that? Just go ahead as if you did not just commit this horrible thing as leaving out question 4. And I was obsessed with what question 4 might have been. What could Mary have left out? What was she eager to say that she left out? What could the 4th question have been? What might it yet be? You know, what is question number 4? And that took me to places of recovery and struggle and some counseling. And I came out of it on the other end with this. And so I'm actually here today to struggle with the wound of question 4, because it got me thinking about other questions that are not familiar, strange, questions we don't know how to ask today, right? And that's what we want to sit with. We are all congregating, as it were, around question number 4, the impoliteness, the rudeness, and the invisibility, the fugitive refusal of question number 4 to be legible, to be intelligible to our senses. We want to sit with that invisibility for a second, or for many seconds, and see what happens. So if this goes wrong, Mary is to blame. I just want everyone to know that Mary is the instigator of this space and this gathering together. Mary, thank you for that. All right, let's jump into the slides now. There we go. Yes. Please let me know if everyone can see this. I have taken great pains to make the best slides you would ever see. It's the best, really. It's great slides. Mary, can you see this? Is it okay? Question number 4 is about the spirituality of cracks and the gift of failure at world endings, right? And again, like I said earlier on, it's really about the crime of Mary. What questions are illegible, unintelligible, so beyond our means of making sense of the world as to be invisible. Just a while ago in the VIP room where I was served biscuits and tea, we were asking questions like, can you make me co-host? And what do we do to get out of the breakout? Or something like that. And I thought about juxtaposing, or basically taking that question and transporting the inquirer and the question to a different space-time coordinate. Think about asking that question in 1950. Forget 1950, maybe 2001 or 2000, year 2000. Think about asking the question, can you make me co-host? How out of time and out of place such a question might be. Everyone who witnesses such a question would be like, are you out of your mind? What does that mean, co-host? What does it mean to Zoom? What does it mean to have a president that tweets daily? What does Twitter mean? What is Facebook, right? And this is the issue we're staying with today, that this idea of context and familiarity and the invitation to be humiliated and humbled and brought down to earth by the realization that it could be the case that we are confronted by realities that exceed our capacities of sense making, that exceed our lexicon, our cultural apparatus of making sense of the world, that we're meeting things that exceed us. And that is humbling. I use humiliating in the sense of bringing down to earth, humus, coming down to ground, so to speak. So the question at the heart of this offering is, what don't we know how to ask yet? What is present and absent at the same time, right? And I ask that question, these questions, I frame this battle, so to speak, this wrestling with the divine question number 4, in terms of the issues that are at large today, the problematic crises that beleaguer us as a species, climate chaos, mental health crisis, a pandemic of despair, racial justice issues. It's like a perfect storm, if you will. It's not just that we are in a pandemic-inflected Anthropocene, it's that this has deep complications and consequences for how bodies are noticed and observed and performed, especially bodies like mine. So we are in very difficult times. And I don't need to tell you the story of that. You know that in your bones. I would invite you to feel that again at this moment. This is trouble. There's fire on the mountain. We don't know how to get out of the pandemic. There's talks about it being endemic. Some say that's an advantage. But the idea that we have been irretrievably altered by this migrant virus, and that it could, with some troubling implications, reinforce or reinscribe racial dimensions that have never worked for many of us, in fact, all of us, is something that haunts us today. So we're living in the haunted public. The public is no longer the neutral space of decorum and argumentation and idealism and the promise of the future. We now have to contend with the fact that we're living with the others, and these others make their claims upon us and our attention. So I say here that we live in an imperiled global order, right? We sense this, we feel this at some level. There are different names for this trouble we're in. The end of the world is biblical and epic, right? Yeah, there's things about that that I don't really subscribe to, but I use it sometimes. The apocalypse, the unfurling, climate change. I'll go with Anthropocene. That is no less politically troubled than the other epitaphs that I've suggested here. The Anthropocene is the time of man, right? The epoch of man, the story of our attempts like Icarus to sail into the sky, but we've sailed too close to the sun and we've reinforced the paradigm of mastery. And so we're hurled to the ground. And now it's time to unlearn that mastery. But before I jump ahead of the horse and the cart, I want to ask certain questions that feel resonant in these troubling times, this field we're in. It's, why are we stuck? Why did I clap my hands as I said that? Why are we stuck? Why are we having COP26, COP27, COP28? Why is it that a diplomat wrote to me, who was embedded in those conversations in Glasgow recently regarding COP, the climate gatherings, that people are so disenchanted with the whole thing that some are already saying that, well, there's going to be COP27. Why do we keep flying across the world to have these gatherings over and over again? Why does business as usual feel so resilient, so irrefutable, so obvious that we're blinded by it? It's so commodious that it seems there's nothing else to do except to keep on doing the same things we've been doing. Why do we keep circling around and doing the same things over and over again? And then the most vital question for me, and has been the case for some time, is what if the way we see the crisis is the crisis? What if the way we see the trouble is the trouble that wants to be heard or seen? Or what if the way we attempt to solve our issues is the problem, is the wound that we're being invited to stay with, wrestle with? So a few things more about this idea of post-activism, which in a sense is at the heart of this talk. A few more questions for us. What if healing becomes sick? I'm not sure my people would articulate it that way, but it's something that is deeply recognizable to many of us as we look back over the history of colonization and our struggles for freedom. In a nutshell, and I really despise nutshells, but in a nutshell, we fought the powers that be and we chased away our colonial masters. But in winning the day, in saving ourselves, we kind of repeated the epistemology of the master. We reinforced the ontology, the philosophy, the cosmovision of the master by chasing away our masters. We put up a flag when we put down the Union Jack. Speaking about Nigeria specifically, for those of you who don't know that I'm Nigerian, and for those of you who don't know Nigeria, Nigeria is just west of Wakanda. You might recognize Wakanda. But we pulled down the Union Jack and we put up the green, white, green of Nigeria. And then we subscribed fully to the global nation state order, right? And now it seems we're even more impoverished. When does healing become sickness? When does the thing to do become just as problematic as the thing we're trying to recover from? There's a term in medicine called iatrogenic or iatrogenesis, which describes what I've just asked in form of a question. When the application to heal provides the opportunity or the conditions for ongoing sickness, like leaving one's gloves inside someone's stomach after operation and after you've closed up the body. That's iatrogenic. And how does that reinforce the problematic familiar, keeping us trapped in familiar arrangements of power? The question really at the heart of this is the title of your beautiful gathering. What happens when things fall apart? Is that such, should we easily or conveniently pathologize that? Or are there other things that we can notice about when things fall apart, right? And so this is what I want to say about that things falling apart speaks about wounds, openings, ruptures, fissures, fault lines, discontinuities. But what we want to do here is to resist the attempt or the imperative of fixing wounds, because as I've tried to portray so far, our many attempts to fix our many issues only returns us into the incarceration of those issues. It seems our attempts to run out of the system reinforces the system. It's a riddle of some sort, a cosmic riddle posed to us, modern citizens. So what do we do with wounds then? How do we reframe wounds? So I want to suggest these points. Remember here that question 4 is the materialization, the emblem of this wound we're working with, right? So we want to put it to work, but to do that, we need a different cosmo perception, a different story, a different understanding about humans and agency and accountability and dreams and what it means to be responsible or accountable. We need to reframe that because the current paradigm seems to be exhausted and hollowed out. And the resources we put to task to help us escape the slave plantation only seems to tether us to it. So my first point to reframe the wound and to offer a different cosmovision is to characterize it as a vision that refuses to see humans as separate structures. I feel these are some of the features of this cosmovision. Some of you might recognize it in your work, in your explorations of indigenous realities, post-humanist, feminist, Black studies, all those realities, you might recognize some of these. This is not encyclopedic, but it's a helpful cartography. So it refuses to see humans as separate structures, as faits accompli, and instead invites us to notice that the very notion of the human is imperial, is colonial. When we talk about the human is not the anthropological or anthropomorphic figure that we're used to. The human is instead a territory of behaving and acting, a space-time coordinate that is, well, you might say, that's characterized by a certain geometric relationality with the world. Modernity is the paradigm of the individual. What it wants to do is to flatten the natural world, to flatten the more than human into resource, into means for the instrumentalization and the ascendance of the self. And one way it does that is to pathologize or to externalize or to create a gilded interiority. The subject becomes this isolated box, this consumer, this pixel, this atomic Newtonian Cartesian entity that is divorced from a moving, vibrant, vital world. So I'm simultaneously speaking about a cosmovision of vitality, where things are not static, where the world is too promiscuous to congeal into one single ideology because it's constantly moving, you see. It's post-humanist, it's agentially performative. This other notion, this other feature is that such a cosmovision, as instigated by a reframing of wounds, wants us to treat agency as beyond individuals, right? It's not left entirely to us to save the day. Let me tell you a quick story. I'll make it quick because we don't have much time and I want us to bring our voices in. This is the story of the libation from ancient Kemet. Kemet is the old name for Egypt in Africa. You might have seen Africans, and I don't know if it's popular where you come from, but we tend to give libations. We tend to offer libations. We will pour wine and drink to the earth. And in doing so, we ritualize place. We gather together, we offer prayers and blessings. I always thought it was a waste of wine when my father and his friends did it. Why do this? Why pour this to the ground? Who are the gods that you convene every time you do this? And then I studied deeper into it and I heard of a beautiful story, a tragic, terrifying story, but a beautiful one nonetheless, that happened in Kemet and speaks about the god Ra being a drunkard, slouched, fallen by the side of his own temple. And people who came to worship are basically pointing at him. Children, women, men are pointing at him and making fun of him. Ra is angry that such base and mortal beings would mock his glory. And so he stomps off to heaven. And in heaven, he's still throwing a fit. And his daughter, who also happens to be his wife, who also happens to be his sister, don't ask me how any of this is possible, whose name is Hathor, comes and says, "What's wrong? Why are you so angry?" And Ra complains and speaks about the rudeness, the impoliteness of Mary Smill's question 4, and sends Ra to earth to deal with mankind and to eat up everyone and leave no one undone. And so Hathor comes down to earth and does as she's told. She eats up people, and every day and night she would kill and leave puddles of blood in her wake. But just before she goes to bed and ends the day, she would lap up the blood and leave everywhere dry and continue the next morning. It happens that people started to pray to Ra to forgive them. Please forgive us, stop this siege, save us from this terrifying deal. And Ra started to take pity. And so he calls back Hathor, except Hathor does not want to stop. So she resists being summoned and continues her work every day. So there's a crisis for the gods and for people. Now, no one knows what to do because Hathor is like a pandemic and rages through everything and nothing works. But the story ends this way, that it takes a convergence of gods and people coming together to create a trick. The story is longer than that, but it takes this coming together and meeting each other in the middle. So gods stopped becoming gods in a way, and people stopped becoming people. They became monstrous middling agents. And somewhere in the mutated middle, they found a trick. And this trick was to pour wine on the earth and trick Hathor into thinking that she had left a puddle of blood, untaken. And it worked. So Hathor would come and say, I thought I took this. And she would drink the puddle of wine and she would fall to sleep there. And that became the origin, the mythological origin of libation. It is how we remember that we're sustained by a trick, that this is not left to us, that solutionism blinds us to our complicity, our imbrication with archetypal cybernetic flows beyond the human, that if we attempt to address our issues with the epistemology or within the epistal ontologies of the individual or the individual's institutions, then we will tend to repeat our problems. That it would take things falling apart for things to come together. That's Anima Mundi, that's James Hillman, that's all of that. This cosmovision that I speak of will stretch accountability. It will link responsibility with shifts, with microbial matterings, with social material becomings. And by that, I mean that how we eat, how we are eaten by what we eat, are all matters that are usually pushed aside when we consider activism and the legacies of activism. We often think ourselves as, champions of the day or champions in the making. And part of our sociality of change is to leave out the powers, the influences, the instigations, the imperatives of microbes, of viruses, of trauma, of gods and goddesses, disguising themselves as the ordinary in furniture. This is the penultimate one. It treats disability as corporeal inquiry and as speculative fabulation in an open-ended world, right? Instead of treating disability as lack, it treats disability as a portal, as an invitation to sense differently, as exotic sense-making capabilities that are lost to us if we try to sustain the normal. And then finally, and most importantly, I think, it reframes healing and justice in post-humanist ways. And let me get ahead with this exact point. Speaking of the wounds and the Afro-scenic I wish I could elaborate on some of the concepts that are spilling out right now, but there will be more time and more breakouts and more events. I think that wounds are not just objects. They're not just things out there, external things that we can observe and categorize and put in a box. A wound is a network of ethnographies and relationships and cartographies and networks and stuff like that, and placemaking rituals. Mary, do you mind unmuting yourself? Let's just have a back and forth very briefly. When you have a toothache, and I don't know when last you had a toothache, where do you go? What's the first thing that you think of, or where do you go?
Getting help, going to the dentist.
To the dentist, okay. So it's the first thing that comes to mind. When you have a tummy ache, what do you first consult?
Go to my medicine cupboard and see if I had anything in there. And if not, I'd move on to the doctor.
Go to the farm, right. So it is, thank you, Mary. You're redeeming yourself. It is possible to trace out ethnographies from sites of cracks. I'll speak about cracks in time. That a virus is not just a virus. A virus is political, spiritual, theological, gastronomical, economical. Just like we know, the coronavirus had all these effects, right? It was this assemblage of effects. It has now shaped and reshaped how we work, how we meet the screen. That's all the virus, right? We're thinking as assemblages, not as atoms right now. In that same sense, a wound is an ethnography. It takes Mary from her home to another part of her home, and maybe to the pharmacy, or maybe to somewhere else. In a different context, a toothache might be an instigation to visit the village shaman, right? Because the village shaman might say to you, your toothache is your grandmother speaking from the dead, wanting you to notice something else, right? That wound on your arm is a sign that we should all bring out our buckets because it's about to rain very heavily, right? So wounds are not just things. They're placemaking rituals. They're geometries of care and harm. They're modulations of bodies. They're how we perform and how we are performed by the world. There are two dynamics that I think might be traced out from wounds. One is an ethnography of restoration, regeneration, what we might often call healing. Healing is conservative, at least the sense with which I'm working with the term is conservative. It's about restoring the image that we're used to, right? Restoring the familiar, closing up the wound, getting back to normal, building back better, right? It's about justice, and justice is the software of the public. It's how the citizen is restored to its place. It's the engineering of continuity, the terraforming of the planet. And then there's a different ethnography that is a disability that speaks about the impossibility of return. And I call this shapeshift. I use the other terms like fugitivity, perverse monstrosities, different differences, post-activism. I offered these pictures of tadpoles here, usually experimented upon. And I don't want to go deep into the history of Galvani and galvanism and electricity and how electricity has been found to generate bodily productions, limbs, and all of that. But I'll just put it this way in short form, that some scientists were able to cut off, aspects of a particular species of a frog, a tadpole, and by applying some measures of electricity, they were able to help the tadpole regenerate the lost limbs. In a sense, that's healing. But there were other perverse operations of this electricity, this electrical generation of limbs that gave birth to transmutations, where the tadpoles grew, for instance, eyes on their backs. So there's literally an article called Frogs with Eyes on Their Back, where, and I'm not talking about just vestigial organs. These eyes could see. Some frogs grew eyes that could see on their backs. I know Tara is making a face like, ew, that's ugly, that's horrible. But really, we're speaking about how to make different differences. And we're coming to realize that to make different differences, to make quantum leaps, we have to become monstrous. To use French philosopher Deleuze's term, that to think differently is to become monstrous. Becoming monstrous is not literally about becoming Frankensteinian. It's about losing our way. My people say, in order to find your way, you must lose it generously. You must stray away from the circuitry of the familiar in order to generate new forms of being in the world. Maybe we are stuck because we perform inexorably an ethnography of regeneration, committed and imbricated with the images that we're used to. This is what exerts and informs the solutionism that performs climate justice, racial justice, epidemiological justice today. But the world is also enacting other moves of its own. And it's inviting strange kinds of disabilities, inviting things to fall apart, to come undone, and inviting us to stay with those places of undoing, refusing to patch them up, but to steal away into the cracks, the portals that these worlds are generating. I'll say a bit more about that before we leave or close, or before I open space for questions. So the latter, this ethnography of shape-shifting, is what I call a crack or failure or resisting convenient solutionism. You can think about it as the thorn in the flesh. I like this example from the Christian scriptures about Paul, St. Paul praying to God and saying, take this thorn away from me. And God says, my grace is sufficient. Like there are wounds that resist solutions. There are wounds that resist healing. And those wounds are sites of excess, something resisting resolution. I think of these wounds as places where an exploding God pierces the flesh, creating cracks that exceed the imperatives of solutions, which is one way of saying that many of the crises we face today may not need solutions. They may need transmutation. They may require us to become something different entirely. They may require us to sit with question 4 a bit longer than usual. I will skip this example because of time, and I'm sure that I've taken 3 hours already. Mary, how am I doing with time? Is it good?
Just keep going. You're doing good.
I should keep going.
Yeah,
great.
Keep going.
Okay. Just a brief example then. 1945, August 6th and 9th, we all know the story of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb blasts, right? And how these explosions were more than just excavatory or displacing. There were other things about it that were generative, not in the sense of being positive, but creating new realities, right? I often think of the pandemic we're in right now as an explosion of some kind. Many people may not realize that the bomb blasts in 1945 to end the Second World War is still echoing in our flesh right now. Because what happened was that those explosions emitted and released carbon-14 into the atmosphere, which settled into oceans, which settled into plants, which settled into skin. As recently as the 2000s, babies were still being born with trace elements of that carbon-14 from the explosions of 1945, which queers space-time in a way, right? So in a sense, we're still participating in 1945 at this moment. And in this very way, we are being recreated in doses by explosions around us, by cracks, irradiated wounds, right? So the cracks of today are much more than things that want to be closed up. They reshape our bodies. Our invitation is to listen to those modulations and to share those modulations as experimentations, as new rituals. And perhaps we might learn how to desire differently. We might learn the lyrics of question number 4, right? So post-activism is the creolization of agency. You know, it's the perversion of continuity. It says, instead of just continuing or getting back to normal, how about you stay with the trouble, using Donna Haraway's phrasing? How about you stay with those cracks? How about instead of putting things together again, you stay with the fact that things fall apart, but maybe that's how things become in the first place. Post-activism is the heart of what I do today. It's the post-apocalyptic spirituality of responsibility. It's a study of things falling apart. It's a study of cracks. It's a study of going beyond solutions. It is a matter of middles, losses, mysteries, and problems that resist resolution. It asks, what are the dangers of winning this war? What are the dangers of succeeding? What happens when victory becomes pyrrhic or too costly for us to bear? And I'll end somewhere along those lines with these considerations. That things falling apart, I could not have wished for a better framing of this gathering, because I think the most important figures and agents of these troubled times are cracks, not humans, not the United Nations, not activists, not shamans, not babalawos, not priests, but the topographical meeting of people and gods and archetypes in a strange middle, cracks. The cosmic crossroads of worlds to come, the trickster in performance, right? And I think of cracks as impersonal flows, dense ontological flows, desire seeking an outlet, like lightning, because lightning never proceeds from the top to the bottom. It's a meeting in the middle, the earth desiring intimacy with the ground and the ground yearning for the sky. And in their stepped performances, they meet each other in the middle. That is, in some sense, a post-humanist re-rendering of activism today that is inviting us to be suspicious of the highway and to look forward to the crossroads, to find ways of composting the images of our social analytics, the ones that easily villainize the other, easily create enemies out of some groups or some factions or some ideologies, and to notice how the world is so resolutely animated beyond those conceptualizations. How do we stay with that? That is the subject of making sanctuary, right? I'll skip all this because I really want to hear you guys. I can send the slides to Mary. Making sanctuary is my formulation of the rich, bold, communal experimentation with staying with trouble. That is about sitting with trouble. It is not a complete archive of things to come. It is a staying with the archival, performative nature of the world and resisting just for a moment at least, but not in any pure terms. I don't speak with absolutes or binaries. Resisting the attempt to rush back to the normal and staying with the playfulness, the playful experimentation of wounds and openings. Maybe in the question and answer session, I could say a bit more about the medieval inspirations of making sanctuary as an aesthetic of the next. But I'll stop here for now by inviting questions. Let me end here. Thank you very much.
I'm just wondering, how do you think that this feeds into the whole concept of end stage capitalism and how the pandemic has just exposed what was there? I know that certainly my generation, the millennial generation, it seems that
Right.
people are just rejecting. We're saying this was always here, and this pandemic has just exposed it.
Yeah.
And people talking about a revolution, and it's almost like, to share something a bit anecdotal, as a person with a disability, I don't want to go back to before.
Mm-hmm.
I have no desire to go back to what was, because what was for me didn't work.
Yeah.
And it's strange to admit in the world where people were grieving so much for what was, to actually say, not I'm glad it happened, of course I'm not, but to say this is exciting because
I know.
we are at the turn of change.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So that really resonated with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I hear your name?
Oh,
Or,
sorry. It's Taylor, but I'm on my partner's
Taylor.
account by accident, so it's Taylor. Hi.
Okay. Hi, Taylor. It's a beautiful question, and it invites for me sitting with geometries of and relationalities of responsibility or responsivity. A quick backstory for what I want to say. We have a son. My dear son his name is Kea. And for some of you who may know me and know my speaking and engagements, my son is on the autistic spectrum, and he's 4 years old. I've told the story many times, and it's the subject of my upcoming book about slowing down. He's a great teacher, and there are many things he's taught me that I could not have articulated if I did not meet him. When he was about 2, we noticed that he wasn't looking at us. He refused to return our gaze, right? It's like Kea, and his eyes were always ecstatic. I use ecstatic in form of beside itself. It was always askew, always elsewhere. And this worrying, this burden that my wife and I carried was, we will never be able to form an interface with our own son. We will never be able to communicate with him. He was always looking away from us. And we worried about that. But in our refusal to solve, and I've also spoken quite honestly and vulnerably about my unintentional, and sometimes I have to say intentional attempts to fix him, to want him to come back to normal, to want him to be sane, right? In spite of my theoretical applications and my public facing conceptualizations, something about this was too grievous for me. We're still working our way through that. But at some point in our meeting Kea in the middle, we came to see the gifts of looking away at. Now, notice the grammatical nonsense I just offered. I did not say looking away from, I said looking away at. I distinguish looking away at from looking away from. So we can look at something, which is to face it. We can look away from it, which is to avoid it. But there's a different geometry of meeting the world, which is what I call looking away at, inspired by my son's sensuous shifting away from the capture of names and images, from the appellations that we ascribed to him, almost fugitively escaping our parental grasp. But there was something beautiful about that informs my response right now, Taylor, that it is often in our attempts to fix the crisis, and I hear what you say about the crystallizations of the pandemic and how it has exposed this horrific underbelly of our systems, right? But it could be that the system inspires us to rise up against it, right? The system could instigate us to do something about it, and thereby reinforcing itself, which is my way of saying sometimes our attempts to fix the system becomes an extension of the system. So a decolonial response is about an animism of the peripheral. It's a turning away, a looking away at, is a refusal to solidify the enemy, right? It's hazy, it's blurry. This is not a discountenancing of capitalism. It's a way of noticing that even capitalism is shifting. even capitalism is moving and flowing, that if the common flu could be a potential cure for cancer, according to the Ohio Research Research Center in Ohio, in the United States of America, then our animism should be so generous that it refuses the categorical or the categoricity of the enemies that we proliferate when we say we're doing activism. So my response to that, if that's not too heady, is that instead of, or maybe I should put it this way, that we need a supplementary politics whose task is not to arrive, is not to clinch the deal, and whose task is to be wary about victory, and whose task is to create new realities in the middle. Not that I'm privileging humans as the forebears of this terrifying deal, but that until we learn to meet in the middle, until we release ourselves from the infatuation of the pathologizable other, we will keep on repeating our mistakes. And maybe that's one way I'll respond to that, Taylor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bayo. Thank you, Taylor, also for taking us into our questions and our answers. To deepen a little more into this, into the questions and answers that we might have, I'm going to ask you all just to close your eyes just for a moment, just to connect with a little more what has been evoked for you through this queer abundance of contemplation that Bayo has offered to us. What's the question that sits within your heart? What's the comment that you'd like to offer for yourself and this collective? Once you've found the question and once you've found the comment, really come into the core essence of what it is that you'd like to say in a very succinct way.
Can I, Joel?
Yes, Mario. And once you say, thank you. And when you come in, please say your name as well for Bayo.
Yeah. My name is Mario. The end of Yeats's poem, he has a question. And this question has always been a difficult, coming from perhaps a racial or colonial stance. And it's this question: What rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? And I was with what you said and what Bayo also said, Joel, about the queer abundance in the not as lack, whatever it is coming. And I was also thinking personally, my age, there's something coming my way at my age right now, as it being something I do not know what it is, but for whatever reason, I am open to it and not scared of the fact that I could just deny this rough beast. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I will add nothing to that.
Thank you.
To sit with it. Beautiful.
And if anybody else has a question, you might use the raise your hand function, which is found in the reactions, and hopefully my heart will guide you to your putting your hand up. Keith.
Hello, pardon me, yes, Bayo, it's Keith here.
Hello,
in
Keith.
East London, a very rich multicultural part of this city. But I think I'm finding myself looking back. For some of us of a certain age, this is not the first pandemic we've known. The losses of this pandemic aren't the first losses we've endured. And of course, last year, I don't know whether it's been seen in India, that television series, It's a Sin, really brought that time back, that time when I think something happened that you referred to very briefly, but wasn't central, but I think is just so important. And that was the coming together, the huge, powerful coming together of all sorts of disparate people that for a time held such promise, and which unfortunately it looks as if we threw away, because the people who came together ended up being really the cheerleaders for what now has become neoliberal individualism,
Yeah.
consumerism.
Yeah.
It could have been so different, but I think that coming together is perhaps the fundamental thing. This may be more a comment than a question, but I'm sure there's more that can be said. That solidarity, soulful solidarity, I think feels the most important thing of all.
Keith, thank you so much for that. I think a rich we is desired. We, W-E, a rich, stunning we is desired and desirable in these times. Shared disability breeds community. And until we see the agencies of this moment, the swirls and the worlds of possibility in terms of disability or generative incapacitation or cracks and failure, there's always the temptation to return to the highway. And the highway is not working, like Taylor brilliantly said. The highway is not leading to places that are pleasant anymore. This dissociated individuality is troubling, to say the least, and it has deep and lasting ecological consequences. So what we want to do is to find ourselves in our woundedness, in our shared woundedness, and consult with new gods.
Thank you, Keith. Laura, please come into the heart of what you'd like to ask Bayo.
Hi, I'm Laura.
Hi, Laura. Hello.
How do we give up, and is there a sacrifice?
The most succinct question, and yet the most powerful, I think. I think there comes a time when we will have no option but to give up. There's something beautiful about resilience and determination and the Churchillian invitation to never, ever, ever, ever give up, right? I like that. I like hope. But there's also noticing that hope can be colonial, that hope can be imperial, that bland and utter continuity can often lead to diminished returns. I want to stay with the fugitivity of hopelessness, not hopelessness as the estranged other of hope, but hopelessness as the already implied heart of hope. That is, we cannot tease them or cleave them apart. What does it mean to come to the end of our rope? What does it mean to come to a place where we're like, I don't want to continue? Or even if I try to continue, I no longer have legs to do so. In a sense, the great resignation, as the Time magazine or what CNN and MSNBC and Fox News are calling the fact that people are no longer willing to go back to their workplaces, this great resignation could be a signal to what people are feeling about these times. They're asking perverse questions. And even if they want to go back to work, something gets in the way. There are new obstacles in our paths, perhaps a goddess, perhaps question 4. But the invitation, I think, of our time is to notice that we will not do these things on our own. So to your question, how do we give up? It will take a topographical shift of epic and sometimes minute proportions that will lead us to develop monstrous limbs, which will stop us from doing the things we're used to. And then we will have to do things differently. So the question for me, back to you, is where does it hurt? What gets in the way of your continuity? What stops you in the middle of a conversation from continuing and you're like, I don't really want to have this conversation now. but I just feel compelled to because of social pressure. If we galvanize and think with those visitors and share them with each other, we might create a fugitive politics together, a weird politics. That's my take.
Nice, Brother Bayo. David White speaks about beautiful questions. I think there's a really beautiful questions for us to hold. Sam, can you bring your offering, please?
Sorry, my head can't form it. So, and you speak in such an eloquent way that my brain doesn't follow, but my heart follows, and you speak it so beautifully. And I thank you so much. And I don't think you were in the dream matrix this morning, but everything you said has been picked up with the dreams, the legs, the monstrous births. People gave birth to monsters in the dreams. And so it's not a question, but I just want to honor you and everyone for what has been brought. I'm really sitting in awe. So thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. Yes, we're doing this together. Doing this together.
Wonderful. Joe, take us a little deeper, please.
Hi, I'm Joe. Thank you so much. And I'm sitting with a tension here between everything you've said, which I understood, and well, up to a point, and believe and think is wonderful, and the fact that we live with current suffering, crises that are about to hit, that we wish to deflect, such as the climate crisis, and thus a huge push to do something now, to be activists, not post-activists. And I'm sitting with the tension of understanding what you've said and the huge push to do something. Okay.
Thank you, Joe. I think this is the one I was really waiting for. This is the question this is question number 5, actually. This is what I was really waiting for to respond to. I never think in terms of purity. I think in terms of intensities, measures, fields of acting, fields of possibility, divergence and convergence, never in terms of a single principle. So with that, I want to say that none of what I say is about dismissing the treasured business of addressing the real and practical and immediate things before us. So when I tell people the times are urgent, let us slow down, I do not mean that if your daughter falls into a den of gorillas or lions, you want to go for a shaman. If you can reach out and drag your child out of that situation, then please do. So it's not about saying that or dismissing activism. Post-activism is not after activism. And it's a troubling of activism. It's a troubling of doings. It's noticing that there will come a time when doing more and more will actually add to the problem, right? I'm a recipient of the benevolence of the West as a child from Africa. And I know the laptops and the aid and the foreign aid that has come into my country. Like, we need to help you guys take our foreign aid, right? And we're like, yes, we need it. Let's take it. And that only re-engineers our subservience to these paradigms. So it's like there will come a time in terms of measures, in terms of intensities, in terms of movements, there'll come a time when doing more and more of the same thing will no longer be the correct thing to do. What happens when truth itself changes? So because we live in an open-ended, always promiscuous, almost always teenage universe that is still figuring itself out, then we want to be animated in how we respond to it. Post-activism is not a superior, in fact, there are no post-activists. I don't think in terms of like, oh, Samantha is an activist, I'm a post-activist. She's a dinosaur, I'm a millennial. So no, it's not like that. I don't think in terms of some new thing. I think in terms of troubling what we already know and excavating from there the actors that were always part of that territory. This is inviting us to stretch our notion of accountability. So in your doing, new questions might come up. are in fact already there. Post-activism is the invitation to stay with those questions that we often push aside in order to do our business. That's a short form of my response, Joe.
Okay. So we're aiming to finish questions by 5:02. So we've got 4 people left. We've got Jade, Juan, Joanna, and Joel. So Jade, if you could come in now, please.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Bayo. I've heard you talk before, and it's always really refreshing. I'm sitting with this discomfort as I have spent 2 years in activism, and I sit in this discomfort of knowing this constant paradox that in order for us to survive, we must do nothing. And I'm paraphrasing a lot of beautiful things you said, and it's my own story of what you've said. And in that doing nothing, we accept our extinguishment as an egocentric species. And my question to you is, how do you sit in this uncomfortable space? And what motivates you to continue doing within a framework of not doing and acceptance and relinquishment, and to continue that within a system that isn't yet fully self-aware and doesn't know question 4?
Beautiful. Well, nothing, there's this lyric in the cartoon, and I don't know why I felt, Jade, you might watch cartoons, but I watch cartoons. I love cartoons. I have no option but to love cartoons, being the father of 2 kids. It's the Prince of Egypt. Yeah, it's an old one, Prince of Egypt. And the lyric is when they're singing, and I think Jethro, the father of Moses's wife-to-be, sings, when all you've got is nothing, there's a lot to go around. When all you've got is nothing, there's a lot to go around. There's something about that queers nothingness for me. So that nothing is actually very active, right? Quantum physicists will speak to you about the zero state, the zero line state of a drum membrane. It's not. It may seem like it's zero value, but it's actually performing queer experiments with space-time, so that nothing is always busy. Nothing is never nothing. Nothing is not the absence of activity. It's the profusion, actually, of activity. But your real question here is about sitting with a paradox. And how do I sit with a paradox? It's not quite an issue of motivation, not primarily for me, as it is an issue of disability. I don't know how to do otherwise. And for us, many of us, it may not be the case. Some of us have to go to the legislative houses and seek to be seen. Some of us have to struggle in our houses of parliament, have to go to the courthouses, have to go on the streets, we have to do what our context invites us to do, right? Nothing anyone says could become some universal trope that applies everywhere or to everything, because there's no such thing as everything. No umbrella term for the emergence of the planet or the world. But, so for me, I don't know how to do otherwise, because I've been so struck, and my people have been so struck with the failures of justice, that we must look beyond the fire. We've been so beaten down by those things that were supposed to help us up, that we now have to go down, and go into the ground and seek abundance right there in the grave, the queer abundance of the grave, right? So this is why we speak about descent, the hypo-subject, the fugitive, because the plantation isn't working for us. So it's not resolvable. That's why you named it a paradox. We cannot resolve these contradictions. There's no simple answer to it. But if you come to a space where continuity becomes very difficult, maybe the issue or the invitation of the world is to follow that flight, that line of flight away from the circle of convergence. Follow that desirous crack, and you might find that the image is not as resolute as our giant meta-narratives make them out to be. That some people might call it a bypass, But I think, I want to juxtapose again, looking away at with bypassing. Bypassing is avoidance. Looking away at is finding the crack that tells us that our business is not to save the world, it's to sit with the events of when things fall apart. Just for now.
Nice. Juan?
Thank you, Joel. Hi, Bayo.
Hello, bro.
Hi. Thank you for pouring wine with us here today.
Yes.
I wrote 2 questions, so I'll read them and just whatever comes or doesn't.
Okay.
But there were 2 things I was curious about. Are there prophecies from Yoruba tradition that inform your offerings around where we are and the way of things to come?
Yeah.
And 2, you mentioned your learnings, which shifted your understanding of the meaning of libation.
Yeah.
Has there been a key moment or key moments which took you into contact with something other more than the visible material world?
Yes. Oh, there are too many so many stories. You've just broken open. Oh, why are you doing me like this one? I could tell you stories of miracles, stories of things appearing, things that shouldn't happen or things that shouldn't be the case, cognitive events, but it would take time. One that comes to mind is meeting with a shaman well, not a shaman, we call them babalawos, they're priests in the Yoruba Ifa traditions. This was for my PhD years back. And this person telling me things that I cannot repeat here. But that's the most potent one that comes out right now. Another one is in terms of a libation of miracles and things that should not be and yet are, is meeting my wife, and we both knew our daughters' names before we met. And I've written about this in some essays and in my book, actually, that we, quite separate and individually apart, before we met each other, wrote in our journals that we wanted our daughter's name, or our individual daughter's name, to be, our first child's name to be Alethea, not a common name. And we kind of met and we found that out to be true. Small, possibly saccharine and romantic, but the idea is that there are other things at work, forces at work in the world that disappoint modern liberalism and its attempt to situate agency in human flesh. But this has made me stutter a bit, because these are the questions that that bring forth good memories. But the other question is about prophecy. Not that I know of, in terms of the Yorubas and their relationship with prophecy and time and our moments and the future. And that's mainly because I think Yorubas do not think about the future in the ways that most of us do. We don't think about the future as, down the line. We think of time as slushy, circular, so to speak. So prophecy is not about predicting what is to come. Prophecy is about the invitation to look again. Right. So prophecy is like, look again where you are, right? Prophecy becomes an ethnographical project instead of a project in futurism, right? So it doesn't say this will happen in the year 2022. It says, what is 2022? That's the Yoruba indigenous wisdom. What is 2022? What other timelines are here? So we situate our realities with the notion of the man at the crossroads, which is Eshu. And this is another rabbit hole, Eshu, who sits at the crossroads, holding space-time, right? So time is not highway to the future, it's a crossroads. It's an invitation to find the monsters, the aliens, and do business with them, that until you do, things will remain stuck and incarcerated in problems. So that's the prophecy there. Prophecy is not prediction, prophecy is rethinking, reframing, and convening community around those reframes.
Thank you very much. I'm taking from that the potency, the looking again, and the aliveness how you conveyed
Yes.
that. Thank you.
Thank you, bro.
Indeed. We are working with the imperfect. We are working with the incomplete. Joanna, Joel, Kamal, and Mohammed. A word, a phrase, an image that speaks to the heart. There isn't the time to ask your full question, your comment, but something that can allow your voice to be spoken at this time, please. You're muted, Joanna.
I heard you say at the beginning you despise a nutshell, which I imagine is, what I sensed was a conversation with Pullman and his acorn theory. And I think in a way what you've just said seems to speak to that, rather than something teleological, something that goes in.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
I love you already,
Thank you.
Joanna. Thank you. Thank you. Non-teleological, yes.
Thank you, Bayo.
Hello.
I'm going to take, my name's Joel. I'm going to take away question number 4, ... The questions that we haven't asked yet.
Yes.
And we don't even understand yet, and to think outside the system. Thank you.
Thank you, brother.
My dear brother Kamal.
Hello, thank you, Joel. Thank you, Bayo. It's a real honor
Thank you,
to
brother.
hear you, I have to say. So I'm prompted to speak by what you said earlier about your son, and thank you for divulging such personal information about
My brother Kamal, words, phrase, image. Remember that one. Come on, stay there with me.
Okay. So one of the things was about being on the spectrum, let's say, and that's something that I wanted to sort of make firm in a sense. So I also am on the spectrum, realizing this, and I have 2 sons who are also on that, which brings up lots of challenges. But I liked what you said about looking away at, and something of, I know Joel might prompt me, he knows me very well, but
he already has 2 times, brother.
Can I take the risk to not to know, because of the space that I go in, I don't know what I'm going to say until I hear it, and it's a very vulnerable place to be.
Right.
And it prompted me to think about, you know, the looking away at, can we be vulnerable not knowing? Can we trust that hopelessness? Can we trust the vulnerability?
Yeah, thank you, brother. Yes, yes, yes. The trust is a gift. It's not our own capability. The trust is a gift. I have to trust that my sanity is not as complete as the world around me makes it out to be. That my sanity could be a disability, getting in the way of what the world is doing. And that's how I entrust part of myself to my son. And I don't want to fix him. I want to meet him in the middle. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Last word, Mohammed.
Hey, brother.
Hey, brother. I won't say much, just that I look after old people, and so much of what you said resonates with looking at disability again, and people with dementia who, you know, it's not a lack, they have power within them, which I really resonate with what you're saying. And in particular, there's a lady that I look after, Miss Jija. She suddenly sings in Yoruba, and I don't know what it means, but I feel I can hear this while I speak to you.
Oh man, Mohammed, we have to be in touch after this. Can we do that, please? I'd like to have a conversation with you after this, please. But thank you all for your beautiful questions. And question 4 will not be figured out now, but we can wait. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So it falls to me on behalf of the whole revision community to say an enormous thank you to you, Bayo. There's something particularly revisionist in how we met. I hope Mary won't mind me saying this, but I have 4 questions and then only 3, because Mary is dyslexic. So it was a woundedness in that brought us together, and the synchronicity of that just belongs so much in this community. It felt important to say it. And there's been, I have really felt a meeting with a human embodiment of the trickster, who is also one of our gods. So I've so appreciated, personally, I've been deeply moved by what you've said, and especially the things that you shared of your own story. And all of us who've traveled through revision know the power of telling our stories and the paradoxical healing of going into the woundedness. So we couldn't have found a more fitting and fitted keynote speaker. It's been a pleasure to meet you. It's been an inspiration to listen to you. And I really, really hope that this connection maybe can be expanded and that we might have further contact and do more work with you, because it's been a privilege and a pleasure. So thank you very much.
I'll share. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.